Imagine the year 1942. Europe lies in ruins under the iron boot of the Third Reich. Flags bearing the black swastika, spinning within a white circle, fly from the North Cape of Norway to the scorching sands of Libya, from the Atlantic shores of France to the frozen trenches outside Stalingrad. The German war machine appears to have reached the height of its power, and for tens of millions across the continent, the darkest period in human history has begun. And while titanic battles thunder across massive fronts, deciding the fate of civilization, another war, no less terrifying, is unfolding deep in the rear, across the boundless occupied territories. This is a quiet, daily war against the very essence of humanity. For hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and officers stationed in occupied cities, life, despite wartime, was surprisingly comfortable and safe. They were the victors, the masters. They possessed absolute power, plentiful food, shelter, and most importantly, something that was sorely lacking at the front, an abundance of free time. One might think this time could be spent on ordinary human activities, resting, reading, writing tender letters home to mothers, wives, and children awaiting them. But history took a different, far more horrifying and bloody course. Free time, multiplied by unlimited power over the lives and deaths of millions, and richly seasoned with the misanthropic ideology of National Socialism, became a truly toxic, explosive mixture that gave birth to previously unimaginable forms of sadism. The fact is, Nazi ideology was not merely a political doctrine. It was a carefully constructed system of psychological conditioning that provided moral license for the most monstrous acts. It did not simply divide the world into us, Aryans, and them. It created an entire hierarchy of peoples, classifying them by their value and usefulness to the Reich. Slavs, Jews, Roma, and many others were officially, at the state level, declared Untermenschen, subhumans. This chilling word was not just a brutal insult. It was a surgical tool that removed any remnants of conscience from the German soldier. This term, echoing from radios, newspaper pages, and officers' lips, allowed a former Bavarian farmer, a teacher from Berlin, or a laborer from Hamburg to see the resident of an occupied city not as a fellow human being with thoughts, feelings, and a family, but as a biological object, a thing, an animal, as raw material to satisfy their basest, darkest instincts. This psychological rationalization, this indulgence in cruelty, stripped away all moral restraints. And it was precisely when killing, torturing, and humiliating became not only permissible but commendable that violence turned, for many occupiers, into a horrifying, perverse form of entertainment. In the early months of the occupation, entertainment often began with the most simple, yet devastating act: public humiliation. This was not the result of a random outburst of cruelty, but rather an organized, almost ritualized act. In Poland, for instance, German soldiers would organize hunting parties, but their prey were not animals. They were the local intelligentsia. Officers kept lists of professors, doctors, lawyers, and priests, selecting them like actors for a grim play. These respected individuals were forced to perform demeaning tasks designed to break their spirit and demonstrate German power. A priest might be forced to sweep the street, a professor to shovel garbage. All of this took place in front of their terrified compatriots, which amplified the effect. The cruelty escalated gradually. What began as minor humiliations evolved into more sophisticated and psychologically devastating scenarios. There was even a peculiar competition among the German personnel to invent new, more creative forms of torment. This process was critically important for the moral decay of the occupiers. In their letters home, they described the humiliation of civilians as casually as they would a card game or a trip to the movies. This normalization of cruelty was a key psychological step. It allowed them to cross new boundaries without any pangs of conscience. Alcohol, freely available from confiscated supplies, only exacerbated the situation. Evening gatherings often devolved into impromptu stages for brutal entertainment, where power and racist hatred mixed into a lethal cocktail. Once minor acts of cruelty became the norm, the occupiers moved to the next stage, transforming humiliation into a public spectacle. This transformation was a logical consequence of the dehumanization that had already occurred. From then on, cruelty had a dual purpose. It not only entertained German soldiers, but also served as a powerful tool to demonstrate absolute power and intimidate the population. In Warsaw, for example, German soldiers organized horrifying spectacles in the streets. Elderly Jewish men were forced to perform calisthenics until they collapsed from exhaustion. While this happened, the occupiers weren't just watching. They were betting on who would last the longest. Human dignity, endurance, and suffering were turned into a commodity, and the gambling added a unique, perverted flavor to this cruel game. The stakes were cigarettes, alcohol, and confiscated valuables. Such performances were held throughout occupied Europe. In France, locals were forced to crawl through the mud like dogs. In Norway, they were made to perform mock parades while being ridiculed. These spectacles always took place in crowded areas, town squares, markets, or during religious holidays. This was done to maximize the effect of terror. For the German soldiers, it was not just a moment of entertainment, but a social event where they could feel a sense of cohesion based on their shared feeling of superiority. Photography held a special place in this grim ritual. Soldiers posed next to their victims and then sent these pictures home as souvenirs. These photographs are striking in their ordinariness. There is no rage or hatred on display, just a casual form of entertainment. Some of these images were even published in propaganda outlets. Professional photographers hired to systematically document these events treated human suffering as artistic expression, which fully legitimized the cruelty in their eyes. As cruelty escalated, the occupiers began to refine their entertainment, turning it into actual competitions with clear rules and scoring. In the Baltic countries, for instance, locals were forced to participate in humiliating contests where human dignity became the object of gambling. These competitions were designed for every category of victim: men, women, the elderly, and even children. The winners, if there were any, received minor benefits like a piece of bread or slightly better treatment, while the losers faced public punishment. This was not just a display of sadism, it was a complex mechanism of psychological torture that forced victims to fight for their dignity in a no-win situation. Behind these twisted games was a cruel bureaucracy. Officers spent a significant amount of time developing detailed rules to perfect the entertainment. They scored criteria such as the speed of completing humiliating tasks, the degree of subservience, or even the willingness to inform on others. This system created unbearable pressure, putting victims in a situation where they had to choose between their own survival and preserving their honor. Each of these events became a step toward further moral decay. The participants in these competitions, the German soldiers observing, competed among themselves to come up with the most original and cruel trials. Eventually, this became part of their daily routine. Torment and humiliation were as normal as cleaning their weapons or inspecting the barracks. Refusing to participate in these games could lead to isolation from the group. In this way, cruelty became not just a form of entertainment, but a means of social adaptation in a degraded environment. This created a cycle where each new action made the next one easier to justify. In addition to public spectacles, no less horrifying forms of entertainment unfolded behind closed doors. German officers and soldiers who had requisitioned private homes often turned them into venues for parties where human suffering was the main course. In Czechoslovakia, SS officers hosted dinner parties where local residents were forced to perform humiliating tasks, such as cleaning the floor with their clothes or eating scraps from the German guests' plates. It was a kind of dinner theater where the Germans reveled in the spectacle of degradation. This private cruelty was even more refined than the public kind. It was a daily part of the occupiers' social life. Officers competed with each other to host the most creative and unforgettable party, with creativity judged by the degree of humiliation inflicted on the victims. To achieve this, they used the former owner's property as props. Family photographs, religious objects, and cultural artifacts were included in the scenarios to inflict maximum psychological damage. In Poland, for example, educated professionals were forced to perform parodies of their own traditions or recite Nazi propaganda. This process was akin to rehearsals before a show, as victims were made to practice to make their performances as entertaining as possible. Private torture was particularly traumatic because it carried an element of dangerous intimacy and isolation from the community. Without witnesses, the psychological violence could be far more brutal and personalized, often causing deeper harm than physical injuries. The torment was not limited to individuals. The Nazis took a perverse delight in the destruction of entire communities. One of the most insidious forms of entertainment was pitting people against each other, creating drama and conflict that the occupiers would observe as a performance. In Yugoslavia, for example, German officers would spread false information about collaborators or resistance members and then watch as the communities, torn apart by suspicion, unraveled from within. They would place bets on who would betray whom, finding a sick pleasure in witnessing the dissolution of family and friendship ties. These games were highly organized. Intelligence officers studied local dynamics and tensions, crafting false reports to exacerbate existing conflicts. They monitored developments like spectators watching a slow-motion disaster. The sense of entertainment was heightened by complex betting systems that turned betrayal and public denunciations into a form of gambling. Even the forced relocation of villages was turned into sadistic amusement. Families were given impossible tasks with absurd deadlines, and officers would watch, finding humor in their desperation. They deliberately created obstacles to force people into making devastating choices. This type of fun was so pervasive that even religious communities were not safe. In Lithuania, priests and rabbis were forced to perform blasphemous ceremonies that parodied their sacred rituals. This was not just a mockery, but a deliberate act of destroying the spiritual foundations of a society. For the Nazis, even forced labor was not just an economic necessity. It was another opportunity for sadistic entertainment. Work assignments became a stage for creative cruelty, where supervisors competed in ingenuity to make their prisoners' suffering as visible and humiliating as possible. In Belgium, for example, civilians were forced to pointlessly dig and fill holes, carry objects from one place to another, or sort materials that had already been mixed. The Germans watched this senseless labor, treating it as a kind of live performance art. These tasks had no practical purpose. Their sole aim was to break people's spirits. Even the work assignment ceremony was turned into a twisted game, where people competed for the privilege of getting less exhausting work. The occupiers found the greatest satisfaction in the humiliation of skilled professionals. Doctors were forced to be janitors, engineers to dig ditches, and teachers to perform manual labor. This psychological impact was carefully calculated. Supervisors would invite colleagues to observe the prisoners' despair, thereby turning their suffering into a collective form of entertainment. Workers were graded and ranked on arbitrary criteria, and their survival often depended on the entertainment value they provided to their supervisors. Work sites became arenas for sadistic games with impossible deadlines and artificially created obstacles. One of the cruelest forms of torture was forcing skilled workers to train their replacements, German civilians, or POWs, knowing that their own death or deportation would likely follow. When individual and group amusements no longer satisfied the thirst for domination, the Nazis moved on to organizing large-scale public events designed to humiliate entire communities. These were not just improvised spectacles, but carefully planned political performances. In Czechoslovakia, for example, they staged so-called gratitude ceremonies. Entire towns were forced to participate in shows where citizens had to express their thanks to their occupiers. People dressed in traditional clothes, prepared food, and performed dances, while the Germans watched, savoring the contrast between the forced joy and the hidden revulsion. These events required months of planning, which revealed their true importance to the occupation administration. Local officials were forced to form committees, implicating the entire community in the organization of its own humiliation. This was a form of bureaucratic sadism. The very process of preparation became a separate form of entertainment for the occupiers, who watched as local leaders struggled with impossible demands. Special attention was paid to costumes and choreography. Participants were made to wear humiliating outfits that often included Nazi symbols or mocking signs. The choreography was designed to force people to perform physically uncomfortable or culturally inappropriate movements. For example, the elderly were forced to perform energetic dances and religious leaders to make gestures that violated their beliefs. Even traditional songs were rewritten, their lyrics replaced with Nazi propaganda. This kind of cultural warfare was aimed at destroying a nation's identity and heritage. Like any flywheel of evil, the cruelty in the occupied territories did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the result of a deliberate and systematic process of psychological normalization. This desensitization began long before the war, during military training that taught soldiers to view their enemies as subhuman, but it accelerated especially during the occupation when soldiers were cut off from familiar moral norms. Peer pressure was one of the most powerful mechanisms. Newcomers who were initially shocked by the cruelty quickly succumbed to the pressure from their peers. Not participating in the entertainment meant becoming an outcast. Cruelty became a form of social bonding. Soldiers who mocked civilians together felt a sense of group belonging and superiority. To maintain a psychological distance from their own actions, the occupiers used distancing language. In their diaries and letters home, they described humiliation and torture as recreational activities or games. This language allowed them to avoid realizing what they were doing and to escape moral qualms. The competition among officers to invent the most creative form of cruelty reinforced this behavior, as success in this matter promised a promotion. All of this was supported by a bureaucratic system where reports on civilian humiliation had the same status as reports on military operations. As the defeat of the Nazi regime became inevitable, the occupiers' cruelty did not diminish. On the contrary, it intensified. Knowing that their time in the occupied territories was coming to an end, they began to stage so-called farewell ceremonies. These were the final, most perverse acts that combined all previous forms of humiliation to inflict maximum psychological damage before their retreat. The Nazis perversely enjoyed even the process of destroying evidence of their crimes. They forced civilians to participate in the burning of documents and photographs that documented their own suffering. This morbid irony was another form of entertainment. During their retreat, soldiers also staged gratitude ceremonies where civilians were forced to thank them for their liberation. These final acts were not only acts of revenge, but also an attempt to leave as much trauma as possible in their wake. Some of these amusements were so cruel that they could be called legacy projects. They were designed to inflict permanent psychological trauma that would forever remain in the memory of the people. Even in the face of inevitable defeat, the occupiers were committed to extracting the maximum entertainment from human suffering, showing that their actions were not a random deviation, but a logical extension of their ideology. This chilling history of Nazi entertainment in the occupied territories leaves behind a heavy legacy that extends far beyond physical wounds. The deepest and most enduring trauma was the psychological damage passed down through generations. Victims of systematic, recreational cruelty lived with a collective trauma that often was more devastating than direct physical abuse. They were not merely witnesses, but participants in their own humiliation, forever etched into their psyche. This aspect of the Holocaust reveals a particularly disturbing truth. It was not just about mass murder, but about the systematic enjoyment of dehumanization. Cruelty was not a side effect of war. It was built into the very system for political and sadistic purposes. The diaries and letters of German soldiers are invaluable testimonies to this. They show how quickly and how deeply cruelty became normalized, how ordinary people could be drawn into evil, perceiving it as mundane and even justified.